Good afternoon. My name is Erik Nisbet. I am the Owen L. Coon Professor of Policy Analysis and Communication, as well as the Director for the Center for Communication and Public Policy in the School of Communication at Northwestern University. I want to thank you all for joining us here today. Today's fireside chat is sponsored by the Center for Communication and Public Policy and the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs at Northwestern University. I want to thank Dr. Deborah Cohen and May Malone and the Buffett Institute for the support and their assistance for lunch today, for this venue, and helping us organize this event and bring in Dr. Nicholas Cull. Thank you very much. Today's topic is something that's, I think, dear to both of our hearts today. Since President Trump's inauguration, I had to calculate this, only 122 days ago, we have witnessed a seismic shift in America's approach to foreign policy and diplomacy. Even more importantly, from at least my perspective, we are seeing a systematic dismantling of the institutions and organizations that promote America's soft power. These organizations help make sure that America has a voice abroad and combat foreign disinformation and propaganda. These include, just a short list, U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, the U.S. Global Media Agency, including the Voice of America and Radio Free Liberty in Europe, the United States Institute for Peace, the State Department's Counter Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Office, the National Endowment of Democracy, just to name a few of the institutions and organizations that were for decades pillars of America's soft power, voice in the world, and tools to counter foreign disinformation and propaganda, as well as help people around the world. So I forget that, the service that they did. This dismantling has been coupled with a pivot towards Russia and its foreign policy, in our foreign policy towards Russia, trade wars with close allies, policy rhetoric about, here's another list, taking over Canada, Greenland, Panama Canal, and Gaza. And as we saw yesterday, public spectacles of lambasting, attacking foreign leaders and allies with false or misleading information in the Oval Office itself. So our speaker here today will help us make sense of this. It might be a tall task, but at least it's a start. Understand this new era of American foreign policy and diplomacy, how these policies impacts America's global standing, and how they pose risks to its national security and that of others, including our allies. Mm-hmm. So, okay. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Nicholas J. Cull, Professor of Public Diplomacy at USC's Annenberg School of Communication. He is a world-renowned scholar on the role of public engagement in soft power and foreign policy. He literally is its best-known historian and authority on the history of public diplomacy and soft power. He is the author of The Cold War, the United States Information Agency, American Propaganda and Public Diplomacy, 1945 to 1989, The Decline and Fall, the United States Information Agency, Public Diplomacy, Foundations for Global Engagement, and his most recently published book, and the focus of today's conversation, Reputational Security, Refocusing Public Diplomacy for a Dangerous World. I've admired Professor Cull's work for many years. I've known him at least 10 years now. We've intersected in various capacities, and I am thrilled to have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cull.
Thank you, Erik, and thank you for having me. Thanks to the Buffett Center and to Northwestern. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was supposed to be here in March. I had to cancel because of family difficulties, and it's great to be invited back to this to have a second date. For this talk, I'm touched by the effort that you've put into bringing me here. So thank you very much. I just hope I don't disappoint.
I'm sure you won't. So Professor Cull, I've sort of set you up here, and you've introduced this concept. You promoted this, developed this concept of reputational security in your recent work. Could you maybe talk about your motivation in developing and introducing this concept in the first place? Elaborate on how reputational security maybe differs or is similar to concept of soft power, and why you think it's relevant in today's climate.
Yeah, okay. Well, that is a very that's a very good question. The reason that I began thinking about reputational security is because of my contact with diplomats. So this idea came from a mismatch between what I was reading in the theoretical literature and what diplomats in the field and people engaged in foreign policy in small countries were telling me was their reality. And the dominant theory of reputation in the United States since the end of the Cold War has been this idea of soft power, that you can use a positive reputation to get more in the world. And the way that soft power it works and is analyzed is that the most successful countries can do things to be even more successful, and that it's this extra thing that maybe the top 30 countries have. In fact, there's a well-known index of soft power called the Soft Power 30. And that started me thinking, but there aren't just 30 countries. What about the no power 170? Where do they fit in all this? And then when I was traveling in the immediate aftermath of the outbreak of war in Ukraine in 2014, I was picking up on a real mismatch where diplomats were saying, no, we're not interested in getting more, we just want to keep what we have. And so in Kazakhstan, particularly, they were terrified. The foreign ministry was terrified of what had happened in Ukraine and felt that the part of the reason that had happened was that Ukraine didn't have a reputation in Western Europe. And the Ukrainians themselves have conceded this. They've said that they really failed to tell their story. And this was like turning soft power on its head. And opening a conversation around issues both of reform, because sometimes the reason you don't have a good reputation is because you don't deserve a good reputation, but also around communication and culture. And a thing that I was happy with once I'd started thinking about this link between reputation and security was that it didn't just work for the world since 1989. It actually described everything. And it was a concept that I could find support for going all the way back. And it works in analyzing the ancient world. When I was talking about this in Amsterdam, there were scholars of the Dutch Golden Age who said, oh yeah, we even had a word for that. They said, we even had a word for that. We called it the diplomacy of honor. And it just made complete sense. And they could go through examples of reputational security thinking in the Netherlands at that point. And so part of what I think is what I want to go on with the concept is to not only have a conversation about public diplomacy that is not limited to the most successful countries, that is not limited only to accentuating the positive, but is also about eliminating the negative, not just the negative images, but the negative realities. So linking it to discussions of reform, and that is not restricting a conversation about reputation to single countries. And the final thing that I thought was misleading and unhelpful in the idea of soft power was that soft power pushed concepts towards a battle royale of all against all, a beauty contest of nations, where if somebody decided to learn Italian, this was a defeat for the French, right? Or that there was no, rather than a victory for global cosmopolitanism, right? Where we were all rivals for a limited pool of global attention. Whereas I think the reality is that we are considered collectively.
Mhm.
And we need a concept of reputation that includes collective reputation, because it's our collective reputation, and this is my final opening point, it's our collective reputations that are under attack. When our detractors in Moscow go after the West, they don't say that the corruption that might happen in London is unrelated to corruption that might happen in Paris. It's part of, you can't trust those people at all. Our reputations are interlinked. Our reputations are attacked collectively, and the pushback has to be collective, and we have to work together to generate a positive reputation and to ensure the integrity of a positive reputation. And this means that if one member of a reputational group suddenly decides to head in the other direction, it is a very, very serious problem.
So that's a really interesting. It's not. Hello.
It takes a couple seconds after you turn it on to connect.
That's a really interesting, I think, critique. Thank you. That the difference between reputational security and soft power, where, as you said, soft power is always thought as unique attribute of a single country.
Yes.
This power of attraction and persuasion, where reputational security in itself is a collective, multilateral resource.
That's correct.
That's built not singularly by a country, but in collaboration with others.
Yes, and if I have a say $1 million to spend for reputational work, it might be that the best place to spend that money is not as a British person, not in London, but in Moldova, equipping Moldovans to do a better job of presenting themselves to the world and telling the world what they would lose if Moldova disappeared. Right? Do you see what I mean? So, and I think this actually relates to changes that have happened in media technology, where, but maybe we'll get into that.
Okay.
Into that later.
So I think you lead into my next question, and basically, then how does reputational security as a concept or a practice contribute to a nation's security infrastructure overall? We talk about our military, our
Yes.
economic, our technological. There's terms like smart power, sharp power, soft power. So when we think about our overall national or international security, whether it's the United States or another country, as you mentioned, how does reputational security intersect with these other dimensions of state power and foreign policy?
Well, I think with reputation gets us into the realm that has been metaphorically categorized as the idea of a national brand.
Mhm.
And that if you have a positive reputation, everything is easy for you because people have a degree of trust that what you say you can do will actually happen. And if you don't have that reputation, it's like you are perpetually in a walking uphill, or you have a perpetual headwind where people are skeptical or more likely to trust somebody else. And so, I think that there are different levels of reputational benefit that come from, or different levels of security that come from having a good reputation. That it can be that it's easier to be part of alliances, it's easier to generate consensus, and you have those kind of convening powers that Nye talked about, in his soft power. But also, when something bad happens, if people like you, they're much more bothered. I was really struck when the earthquake hit the Eastern Mediterranean, that it affected both Syria, without a reputation, and Turkey, with a more positive reputation. And people called it the Turkish earthquake and sent aid to Turkey, but they didn't send, nobody talked about what was happening in Syria, because Syria has a bad reputation. So it was like the disadvantage, the same event in Syria was addressed completely differently because of the reputation of the place. And there are some really good examples historically of bad things happening to places that people like, and a disproportionate benefit coming to those places. For me, historically, I could see that in a crisis, reputation really matters, and that reputation could include cultural salience. Do you know anything about the culture where this thing is happening? And to me, the moment that was the tip-off was in the run-up to World War II, when the UK had to decide whether or not it was going to support Czechoslovakia and confront Hitler and refuse Hitler's territorial demands in Czechoslovakia. And Neville Chamberlain goes on the radio and actually says to the British people how terrible it is that we should be thinking of war over a far country and a people of whom we know nothing, as if to say, if we knew who lived in Czechoslovakia, if we understood what that country was about, this might be a different story. And then 6 months later, he gives an absolute guarantee to Poland. And I wondered, did the British people know Poland better than they knew Czechoslovakia? Turns out, yes, 4 times as many mentions of Poland in the Manchester Guardian over a 20-year period than there are mentions of Czechoslovakia. The basic polling that happened at the time showed people were very, very aware in Britain of Poland, not aware of Czechoslovakia. And so working out how you can be Poland, which in 1939 isn't a great place to be, but it's probably better than being Czechoslovakia, seemed to be one example of how reputation plays into security.
No, thank you. And that seems, so some of the examples you've shown is how reputational security can help from a defensive perspective, or to ward off or a crisis. Is there a way that countries can leverage reputational security to promote their foreign policy goals more proactively, in your mind?
Well,
Or some examples that come to
I
mind?
think just by being known is, so I see this as a defensive concept. And one, again, part of the formative process was I did an interview with the deputy foreign minister of Kosovo, who had nothing else to do that lunchtime, so he was happy to talk to me. And he described the moment when a Kosovar woman won a judo gold medal in the Olympics. And he said that that was an essential moment in the security of Kosovo, because it played into the narrative that Kosovo was a country rather than a breakaway province of Serbia. And I think the more things that happened that located Kosovo on the list of real countries, and kind of that Kosovo things began being filed under, for European audiences, under things that are happening in a country called Kosovo, the safer Kosovo was. So Kosovo in the Eurovision Song Contest, Kosovo at the Biennale of Art or Architecture. These small things were part of a cumulative repositioning of Kosovo. I've seen the same thing happening with Taiwan, whose sovereignty is open for debate, but Taiwan is really working to develop a culturally distinct feeling about that location to inhabit a place in the mind of Western audiences, doing a lot with LGBT culture, actually, knowing that there's no way that China is going to do a exhibit around sex and censorship and send it to Venice to be performed in the prison cell where Casanova was once imprisoned. That is a kind of an embrace of liberalism that is unthinkable on the mainland, and is trying to create, perhaps artificially, a cultural impression around
an impression.
the culture of a distinctive culture of Taiwan.
So I think you can give some examples of how countries have enhanced their reputational security. And before we move on and talk about current events in the United States specifically, can you give us examples of the types of activities or factors that harm or destroy reputational security?
I think, and this is where we get into two things. Not understanding where your reputation comes from is like not feeding the goose that lays the golden egg. So I'm really troubled with the UK, whose reputation has come from the creative sector, from ancient universities, and the BBC, to be blunt. So the British creative, well, really just the BBC, actually, that and the Wallace and Gromit. But so when something happens that damages the goose that lays the golden egg, you are, I think, endangering more than just teaching a lesson to the journalists who criticized you last week. You are actually jeopardizing the long-term standing of the country. And that might also include, you have to ensure, for Britain has to ensure the health of its its jurisdiction, because the idea of British fair play, British law and order, that's part of what comes with Britain. In the United States, we could see how, and part of the history of the Cold War is understanding how, when the United States was challenged by the Soviet Union over its racism, this was a major element in Soviet propaganda in the 1950s, the best response was not only to say, oh, we're not racist, but to actually be less racist. And part of Eisenhower's decision to prioritize civil rights, part of Kennedy's decision to prioritize civil rights, was to push back against the Soviet narrative. There were other things they could have talked about, other problems in America they could have addressed, general economic problems, for example, but they felt they had to address civil rights, really because it was on a foreign dictated agenda, and thank goodness it was. So I see this business of reform as being super important, and in our own time, you can see how sometimes when countries have decided they want to increase their reputation by hosting a mega event, I'm thinking here of the Seoul Olympics in '88 or the Qatar World Cup a couple of years ago, that had to also include real domestic reform. So during the run-up to the Olympics, South Korea had to democratize. During the run-up to the Qatar World Cup, the labor practices had to be completely revamped, laws changed to be more in line with the best standards and to head off criticism. But if you try it without doing that, if you just do the showcase event without the reform or with inadequate reform, it's not going to build you the reputation. General Franco tried that. Let's have a few new laws, but basically we'll stay fascist, and nobody's
It's not authentic.
It's inauthentic. Nobody's persuaded. Or the, what do you call it? The Sochi Olympics didn't change how anybody felt about Russia.
Right. No, those are great examples. So, moving forward now and thinking, maybe looking back beyond, maybe looking back 123 days, how would you evaluate, prior to the Trump administration, America's reputational security overall? Or what were some of its strengths and weaknesses prior to the advent of the Trump administration?
Well, I was frustrated by the reputational security policy of the Biden administration, and was part of conferences. There was a great conference on reputational security convened by former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, to point out that the United States wasn't doing enough to secure its reputation in the world. It wasn't meeting reputational challenges in terms of countering disinformation and competing in key markets like sub-Saharan Africa against challenges from China, especially. So I was worried. I was concerned that the Biden administration waited 2 years to nominate a senior, it would be Undersecretary of State, to manage public diplomacy. Can you imagine if there was no admiral of the fleet? People would feel the American Navy was undermined. Obviously, public diplomacy is going to be undermined if there's no official with full, with full power in charge. But operationally, there were some really strong individual operations underway. And the thing that I was most excited by was a reconceptualizing of public diplomacy as shifting from being a question of what can I say to impress you to who can I empower to impress you. And that was really important. And so there were some wonderful State Department programs to help people, well, exactly like I said, help somebody in Moldova do a better job of presenting his government to the world, learning or empowering others. That the public diplomacy specialists in the State Department had started to get that message that that in the 21st century, public diplomacy is not about showing off. It's about empowering others and moving forward collectively. So that to me was the hope going forward. But I didn't expect that we would head into the mess we're in right now. Even reading Project 2025, I thought, well, there's a Venn diagram in which we can agree that Project 2025, said there's a confrontation in Africa. The United States needs to mobilize public diplomacy resources to support democracy in Africa in the presence of authoritarian ideas coming in from elsewhere, right? And so I thought, yeah, we can talk about that we can have a conference, we can make plans together, but that part seems to have been forgotten. And the idea of score settling with people who were rude about you 6 years previously, that seems to have predominated.
Right. Well, now fast forwarding to the Trump administration, one of the very first moves in this area, one of the most immediate moves, was moving to dissolve USAID and freeze foreign aid programs. Now you're talking about public diplomacy, but others would argue that USAID was a key element of maybe America's reputational security in its actions and its support globally, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but in terms of supporting media development, supporting health and economic and democracy programs. So how has
But I'm sure that, sorry to jump in, but I'm sure you remember when we were talking earlier about anti-Americanism. And way back in the George W. Bush administration, this was a thing that scholars looked at as maybe the major issue. And there was this strange anomaly that in Africa, where you'd think people would dislike the United States, they actually remained impressed by the United States. And part of the reason for that was this platform called PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Platform on AIDS Relief, which was a passion project of George W. Bush himself. And Africans really appreciated that. And that's exactly the sort of thing that's being closed. So the thing that preserved the reputation of the US in sub-Saharan Africa has now been eliminated. And now they just have the president who uses street language to say how horrible those countries are, which give it long enough, and that will become that will distort the feeling about the United States in those places.
And do you feel that the dismantling and freezing of USAID is hurting if reputational security is a collective, multilateral concept? how is it not only hurting our reputational security? Do you feel it's hurting others' reputational security as well?
Well, I think potentially, I think as the United States distances itself from a global conversation about democracy, then it will become a sort of outlier. And it's interesting to see how the slack is being taken up by others in some quarters. In fact, with the World Health Organization, China is taking up the slack.
Mhm.
So the problem isn't just that the United States is stepping back from the reputational game, it's that China's leaning forward. And sometimes the United States neglects this, that, you know, the other guy gets a turn at the chessboard every time you make a move, and they're not going to stop making moves just because you sit back, you know. And the idea that I think $500 million is being added to the budget of the World Health Organization by China, that's going to win friends for China, you know, especially as these things are sustained over time. Because just to jump into theory of reputation, that reputation is deeds continued over time. That you have to do it for a long time for it actually to become your reputation, or it has to be so spectacular that nobody ever forgets it.
Well, from the long laundry list I mentioned of Trump's administration's policies and actions since the beginning that took over 122 days ago, can you identify what you think are the number one or two policy shifts or actions they've taken that you think what might do the most long-term damage to US reputational security?
Well, that's a really tricky question. I think that reducing the budget of the Education and Cultural Affairs, ECA at the State Department, by 93% is a really crazy thing to do. Because we know that in the long term, America's closest friends have been cultivated through that program, coming as students to the United States, coming as international leader visitors to the United States, seeing the country for themselves. If the United States is no longer doing that and other countries are, then affections will develop in other places and bonds will develop with other places. And this was already something that was being neglected. A 93% cut. This wouldn't even work in the first Trump administration. Trump 1 increased the budget at ECA to an unprecedented level, well over $750 million, nearly, you know, on the way towards the $1 billion mark. First Trump administration believed in that. Where are we at when we're saying if only we were in the first Trump administration? But seriously, for public diplomacy, I think we have to. It wasn't the worst time in the history of American public diplomacy. It wasn't the worst time in the history of the reputation of the United States. Reputational damage, unless you're talking about something really, really spectacular, reputations are not damaged by one person. And people tend to even discount single acts or acts that occur in a particular sector. So I think that right now, the reputation of the United States has not dropped through the floor. The reputation of Russia dropped through the floor. It went from number 25 in the Anhalt Index down to number 45 just because of the invasion of Ukraine. The reputation of the United States is dropping from number 7 down to looks like it's going to be number 10, maybe number 12. And that's to do with people being worried by the problems in American politics and by problems between American people. because we know in surveys, if you ask people, what do you think about the United States right now? They're worried by the level of distrust between American people. And we assume foreigners looking at the United States think, well, if Americans don't like each other, why would they like me? Right? So they're assuming that it would be difficult here. That doesn't mean they're going to stop buying iPhones, that they're going to not want to send their kids to an American college or even live and work here in some circumstances. So some good things about America survive, but going forward, if the problems last long enough, then damage will be done and enhancements will come to others, because other people will be doing the good things. Other people will have the colleges. Other countries will have the colleges that people want to go to. We'll be telling the stories that capture people's imagination. And other leaders won't be insulting visitors. And right now, one of the unexpected public diplomacy consequences of the current administration is that the style, the abrasive style, the posturing when a foreign leader visits actually helps those leaders at home. Trump transformed the reputation of Vladimir Zelensky back to 2022 levels, where people were kind of falling out of love with him, and then Trump took him to the woodshed, and bang, he's back. Similarly, Cyril Ramaphosa yesterday has South Africa this morning woke up very proud of their president, that he'd stood up to this bully, and he's sort of being seen as the new Mandela, having been a source of some worry for South Africans. Even Keir Starmer is better liked since he had a kind of a rough treatment from Trump. He's like a King Midas, but against his own interests, I think.
Right, he's been political gold for the Canadian election.
Yeah, absolutely. That's
right?
yeah. Well, who thought the Liberals could come back in Canada? That's the best example of it. Yeah, absolutely.
So when we think about this, you are a historian, and so when you think about all these various dismantling or reform or of various American institutions of public diplomacy and foreign policy, USAID. One historical era was after the Cold War. You wrote the history of the U.S. Information Agency, for example. Do you see any parallels, especially when they are talking about closing down Voice of America, defunding, Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia, to the changes that the United States did in its own sort of, shifting priorities, or how it reformed its global voice abroad in the 1990s?
Absolutely. In fact, there is a pattern in America's conversation with the world that the United States does a lot when there's a crisis and then backs away. This actually happened immediately after World War I. All this fantastic mechanism of global projection and conversation that was created by Woodrow Wilson was closed down by Congress as soon as World War I was done. They tried to do it after World War II, but the Cold War crisis came on quickly enough that the mechanisms were preserved. After the Cold War, there was a kind of a unilateral disarmament of America's mechanisms of information. I think it's a really bad idea. But what's happening now is unlike what happened after the Cold War, because after the Cold War, part of the reason that the mechanisms could be taken down is that the crisis had come to an end. It was a different kind of diplomacy. Right now, the crisis is ramping up. This is, it's not just bringing the Trojan horse into Troy. This is cutting down the gates of Troy, chopping them up for firewood and giving the firewood to your friends, and melting down the spears and giving those to your friends too. This is some really bizarre unilateral disarmament in the face of the enemy. And I can't really work out why you would do it. It must only be that it isn't being properly thought through. But it's so strange to me. It's so strange and painful to watch what's going on. But I don't think just blaming one party is the answer. I think we have to talk about what two parties built together, the mechanism that comes from something fundamental in the United States, which is a desire to constructively engage with the world. And we shouldn't let any one politician dismantle a system that's been of tremendous benefit to the whole country. But unfortunately, we don't have the evidence ready to just deploy. Oh yes, look how we did more because of exchange visitors coming here. It was just everything was argued in terms of this is what's right, not let's make an argument as to why it's right. And perhaps the term reputational security can help, because the term soft power made this work just seem like this little optional extra. And no senator, I was told by an undersecretary, no senator wants to endorse something soft. It's almost for Freudian reasons. That's why the term smart power was embraced, because they don't want to be soft. They do like being smart. But reputational security as a concept links it to what is most important for the state, that the state is secure, and makes opposition to spending in this area effectively, I could even say treasonous, certainly deeply harmful to the well-being of the state. A unilateral disarmament, like sinking your battleship, something that is mind-blowingly bad idea.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it's something key to reinforce that the institutions, the organizations, the mechanisms of America's soft power diplomacy were vulnerable. Right? They didn't seem to have a constituency, at least a domestic constituency. I think most Americans shrugged when they say they're shutting down USAID, or great, they vastly overestimated how much money we spend on foreign aid and didn't understand the return that it yielded in terms of reputational security. Same thing for these other organizations, the U.S. Global Media Agency, the Institute for Peace, the National Endowment for Democracy, small fraction of our resources. So it seems to me, is reputational security that fragile? Is it that fragile in other countries? Is this something specific to the United States where we just never really appreciated it? There's not a domestic constituency for, we took soft power for granted, not realizing it needs to be maintained, upheld, and that it goes beyond simply this sort of natural attraction that people like us just because of who we are, and they always will like us. How do we grapple with this?
Well, I certainly think that there's a complacency that people in the United States assume that the United States is the most admired country, and that the position of the United States as the country that invented in the 20th century a kind of consumer capitalism democracy that became a model in other places, that was a personal achievement of the country and will always be admired, irrespective of whether other models emerge or whether other places are better at delivering that model. A thing that strikes me is that maybe if you define what was best about America in terms of social mobility, mass prosperity, in terms of equality, social equality, maybe other places are better at being America than America right now. Maybe the Nordic countries are better at being America, where it really counts, than the United States. Maybe Germany is better at being America than the United States right now. And that's really troubling if the only thing consistent with America is the flag and not the ethical dimension of the country. That in the long term is going to be really troubling. I think with reputation, we have to understand that we're playing for the long game, and we need to do have detailed conversations about what is going on. I think that the Pew work on the reputation of American democracy has been very interesting. And they found that over 40% of people around the world would say that the United States used to be a great example of democracy and is no longer. But you can't blame the world for thinking that. When the same question was asked to Americans, 70% said that America used to be a good example of democracy and is no longer. So if the United States doesn't see itself as a good example of democracy, why should foreigners? You see, so maybe the decline of America's reputation is actually slower internationally than it should be, which is a deeply disturbing prospect. But people are very attached to reputations and don't like to have the mental furniture rearranged. So, you know, I think that small corrections can make a difference here.
And it sounds like, from your perspective, if reputational security is built over a long period of time, and it's also degrades or is lost over a long period of time, that America's reputational security, or some of these factors that have been degrading American reputational security, precede the recent Trump administration.
Yeah,
you feel that this
yes.
decline has been going on since when? Like, for how long? Like, what would be the historical trajectory that you think American reputational security has been taking over the last 10 or 20 years?
Well, if for me, public diplomacy begins with listening. And the first thing we need to do is ask other people, when did you begin to feel differently about the United States? You still like iPads, you still want to see the Grand Canyon, you'd still be cock-a-hoop if your niece got into Harvard, but when did you start to feel there was something off? And answers that I get to that question often go back to the bombing of Serbia, actually, in some places. Sometimes it's the invasion of Iraq. But there is a kind of a quest for the moment when the United States ceased to behave like the inner America. And part of what we're talking about here is the cost that comes from American success. The United States spent a century using a new and miraculous medium of cinema to dramatize its identity in the mind of every person on the planet. And America wasn't just on the cinema screen, it was internal to people, so that people felt that they knew what the cowboy was going to do. They knew what the detective on the American city street was going to do. They knew what American values were. And then when the United States says, yeah, that's what we said, but did you know that there's a place at the end of Cuba where those rules don't apply? That was violating the idea of America that was, you know, not in the White House, not on the cinema screen, but internal to every person who'd ever been impressed by America. It was like reaching into, you know, however many, 5-6 billion hearts around the world and tweaking it in an uncomfortable way. And when this started to happen with the revelations around Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, I was in conversation with people in the Pentagon, and they'd say, but it's not fair. Russia tortures people all the time. You know, America's just doing enhanced interrogation. Why do people get upset when America does it and not upset when the Russians do it? And I said, but you know, Russia has a different reputation. You know, Russia is a place that people somehow accept whatever the virtues of Russia, its politics is rough. And it is rough with opposition, and that might include people ending up in jail. And if you're going to like Russia, you have to forgive it as a level of human rights abuse. The United States is forgiven for other things, right? Its discounts are not in the area of torture, of secret detention facilities. It's more in terms of, you know, okay, I don't really care for country music or something like that, right? Why on earth do they like baseball so much? These are the questions that foreigners have about the United States, not why are people, well, why did the vice presidential candidate or the presidential candidate just turn up mysteriously dead? Though it's possible for those things to happen in Russia without the opinion about Russia collapsing. What can't happen is that Russia invades a neighbor without opinion about the country collapsing.
So before we move to our questions, my last question is, overall, what is your prognosis for America's reputational security?
Yeah, on Colombo, that's always the question.
And what can we do, not only as a country, but as citizens, individually, as Americans or those who live here, do to enhance our reputational security?
Yeah, well, yeah, on Colombo, the last question is always the one that either catches you out or where the whole, this is a really good question. So I think that reputation doesn't just come from presidents, and it doesn't just come from Silicon Valley bros who are helping out presidents. It comes from the decisions made by ordinary people. And I would upset people in California in the early 2000s by saying how Californians treated people from Mexico that they came into daily contact with affected the foreign policy of the United States, maybe more powerfully than what the Secretary of State said or did. And so I would say that each of us has it within our power to help or to hurt the reputation of the United States. The most successful peace-building work in the Cold War came from connecting like with like, connecting people who had similarities across the geopolitical lines. And there's always opportunities for that. And this is what in the book, I call information disarmament. So, or you could think of it as cultural diplomacy disarmament through cultural diplomacy. So the more we can connect to foreigners and people of different experiences and let them know that we are not as they might assume, that there are many ideas within this country, and that there is an American hospitality that still exists. But I think maybe if we also reach out to one another and listen to each other and use some of the techniques that worked during the Cold War to talk to the world to actually help the country connect to itself, we would be headed in a better direction. And at the end of the day, our reputational security is in our hands. Absolutely. As citizens, rather than relying simply on our institutions. The citizen, yeah, because you get ultimately the citizens get the reputation that they deserve. And one of the big lessons I've got from the time I've spent studying this stuff is that you cannot fool international audiences, maybe for a short time, but sometime it's all they will see what's actually going on. And so the best guarantee of a good reputation is a good reality. And the more we can individually do to help a good reality, the better. Right. You can't fix it all just by smoke and mirrors and hosting a World Cup. Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much for your comments. I want to open it up to questions. We have time for questions, and yeah, please, sir. Maybe stand up, introduce yourself briefly, and.
I'm Erik Mao. I'm from the Geopolitical Forum. I really appreciate both of you for the summary, which is reputational security for the United States that rests on each individual. But I did want to look at in the international arena, like in some cases, people never been to the United States. In other countries, cases they've never been to their country, so that lost kind of individual contact level. But in the international arena, how much do you think the reputational security is zero-sum game? Like example you raised, US is out of WTO, China's in. Other countries is out of Africa, China's in. And we need to get back to Africa. So that sounds like a zero-sum game to me. But what part of the reputational security, if there is, that's not zero-sum game. It's like, you can be a good guy, I can be a good guy too, you can be popular, I can be
Yeah,
popular.
absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a really great question. And I think that part of the problem is that certainly with soft power thinking, we kind of assumed a zero-sum game that wasn't there. And if you look in miniature at what happened in the Gulf, between the Gulf states, that they took to saying, oh, say UAE would say, oh, Qatar has such a terrible emir, and Qatar would say, oh, but UAE has such a corrupt emir, or Dubai has such a corrupt emir. Oh, they're all awful. And what they didn't understand was that the entire category of Gulf state was diminished by the fight between those states. And I think that when the great powers have these arguments, not everybody reacts by identifying with one power over another. There's a repulsion against the whole world of geopolitics and the powers that ignore the interests of individuals and smaller countries around the world. So working together, I think, is not only a solution, it is the only solution. And I'm haunted by the awareness that the problems of the world are too big for any one country to solve unilaterally. So therefore, the only way forward is through collaboration. So there is only the collective game. That's the only way we're going to survive. And that, in turn, relies on trust. So our question should not be how do we defeat China, but how do we trust China? And how does China trust us? And in what ways can we work together? And sometimes we don't even know, because we don't talk about the shared experiences, the shared overlaps, and finding the sections where people are able to work together. And I think we can start to build out from that. But I think that the perception of a zero-sum game is a problem. But right now, the biggest chance we have of showing the error of the United States abandoning a $750 million budget in cultural diplomacy is pointing out that China has an $8 billion budget in cultural diplomacy, and saying, well, maybe the Chinese know something or remember something that we don't. You see what I mean? So maybe the answer is to sometimes have a zero-sum game in some arguments, but ultimately to have a win-win objective. Does that make sense? But I think that keeping our eye on the need to collaborate is very important. Actually, this was something that the Chicago's Pope, or the world's Pope, said quite recently, that collaboration is the only way forward. But it's certainly not being helped by bullying, slandering, name calling. These things don't help build trust or collaboration.
Thank you. Other questions that we have for?
Okay. So I'm actually curious, if you could give a more concrete explanation as who one's reputation is intended for, because it's a little vague.
Yeah, sure.
You kind of seem to insinuate that public opinion plays a part in this, but two examples, one of which you gave, first being the example of Syria and the fact that they were failed to recoup any aid in the aftermath of an earthquake, kind of omits the fact that they were under heavy sanction by the United States in particular, and were actually being strangled to that effect. The other, of course, being the Palestinians, who I would say enjoy enormous public support globally. In fact, they'd be a reputational superpower, and yet that doesn't seem to translate into public policy whatsoever. So, yes. Who exactly is one's reputation for?
That's a really important case, and goes into the processes through which reputation emerges, and the way in which reputation from one generation still, or reputation earned or awarded in one generation, can be part of politics in a later generation. And so this might include, for example, countries that have an experience of suffering, who then are assumed to be to have a sort of a special or enhanced reputation by older people, but younger people have a different perception. I think this is the case right now between Israel and Palestine, where you have an older reputation, an older demographic have a historical memory of Israel in one way, and a younger demographic are exposed to new media where they're seeing things happening direct on TikTok and have a different set of reactions that have not been conditioned by previous frames for thinking about the problem between Israel and Palestine. So whoever's right and wrong in this situation, this is the reality, that there is a different conflict based on the platform you're looking at, and different generations have different conclusions about that. And this is a tremendous challenge, I think, to both sides as they talk about the situation that they are in. But yeah, reputation is not uniform, and you can't really talk about a mean level of reputation when one place will be admired by one audience and vilified by another audience.
May I ask
Do you
you a
see
follow-up
please?
question?
But do you see
Yeah.
where I'm going?
I
with
do,
that? I'm
and
trying to describe
I
the
feel like there's
landscape.
something you're not addressing. I mean, so all right, let's take the Syria example. Was the problem in Syria simply that they didn't adequately promote themselves to the American
No,
public,
no.
or the American policy elites?
I think the problem was, probably with the frame that came from the media, actually, and there would
Okay.
have been leadership in the policy elites, but I have not researched how that earthquake was covered, because we were just exposed to it as the Turkish earthquake.
But the earthquake is kind of irrelevant because it's still taking place in the context of the
Yes,
sanction
yeah.
regime over Syria. So that's
Sure.
not relevant.
Not relevant.
It's not relevant. The point is Syria was being cut out from all credit markets. It wasn't just this one incident.
No. But
it
it was
doesn't-
part of
Whether or not people were sympathetic to Syrian people didn't play a part in whether or not they gained access to those credit markets.
That's correct, but it also the event happened to a place that had a reputation created by a whole set of other circumstances.
For who though?
For
Yeah, I mean, so
It happened
that
to-
reputation was
yeah.
like that reputation that was created, who is that important for? Is it important for the American public? Is it the American public that are uniquely or specifically hostile to Syrians, that they would be inclined
well, I
to
think
put
it
them under
was a
sanctions?
sort of a world reaction, but maybe there is a or a Western media reaction, but I think that's something that it would be a really interesting case to look at in detail to see exactly what was going on with that media frame. But so thank you for
Sure.
raising the.
But I mean,
thanks for
that's,
raising the
I
issue.
guess that's kind of presuming a certain like independence of the media as opposed to, maybe other concerns, maybe
Sure, yeah.
larger policy concerns that might influence their opinion on certain matters.
Yeah, no, I think that should be part of an investigation.
Okay.
But
Thank
I'm
you.
not.
That's a good
Yeah,
yeah.
Do you have a question, Heather? Thank you.
I do, yeah. I was really intrigued that you brought up cinema as a kind of ambassador for reputation in a way. And I just wonder if you could unpack that a little bit. It's really interesting. And it seems to me kind of a mixed bag, because during the war, post-war, you certainly have the good neighbor policy translating into filmmaking to some extent. You have the emergence of progressive films about in opposition to white supremacy, more liberal kind of thinking, but then you also have Westerns that are very supportive of white supremacy, or you have film noir showing American police being very corrupt, crisis in post-war masculinity. So it's just really a great example, and I just was hoping you could.
Yeah, no, I
into
think
a little
that's
more.
great. I think that Hollywood works in two ways. That it is a sort of a storytelling, right? So it tells particular stories that people find attractive, particularly the story about the success of an individual or the realization of an individual, the personhood of an individual, and the idea that anybody can have a story. So in Britain, people preferred American films because American stories happen to ordinary people, whereas British stories either happen to people in the past or to certain people in the present. And for working class audiences, if you went to most high budget British films, you wouldn't see the working class character would only come in as the chirpy Cockney cab driver or the faithful servant or something. You wouldn't see your own self represented unless you were going to an American film. So there was a sort of a universe in American films that was about affirming the self. There were underlying narratives of justice, that even if something bad happened, it might be punished, and that America was a land of opportunity and a land of justice. And also, just a lot of the stuff you saw on the screen was impressive, right? You saw big cars and beautiful apartments and tables groaning with food, so that was all part of what was seen about the United States. So I think that Hollywood made America tangible and present in people's lives and rewarded people, and it makes Hollywood even more credible that it would include elements of criticism, that that there's a corrupt sheriff who has to be brought to justice, or there's a sort of a subplot of what do they call it, the snake in the garden theme, that the wonderful thing is in jeopardy. But I think Hollywood has had a special role in promoting the United States around the world, but who knows what future what future stories will connect to global audiences. We can't assume that it'll always be Hollywood. Maybe the 21st century stories are coming from other places and other art forms. So the United States shouldn't rest on its laurels.
Oh, yeah, we have a question over there, right behind you.
So my question actually further expounds on the question just asked previously. And so something I was always curious about was like, when you say Hollywood, right? Are you talking about like the film apparatus that we, like, the American industry supports? Is that separate than like film as a concept, right? Because the mainstream like form of communication today is probably the internet, right? Like most people are disseminating information through the internet. And the internet is largely governed by like mostly big American companies, right? So it's kind of interesting to see that like that same reputational like standard from that you described in film hasn't really translated over to the new medium of the internet, right? Like the time frame you're describing where for that reputational decline, like is around like what, early 2000s, is also when the internet was again picking up too. So I often wonder if that's like kind of a failure of like those companies in creating that same type of image. But yeah.
Well, but I think so. Coming to this as a European, one of the questions is the voice that's telling us that our reputation is in trouble. If you like, go back to the idea of the Garden of Eden, that when Adam is embarrassed and hides in a bush, God says to Adam, but who told you were naked? And right now, for Europeans, who tells us that our societies are corrupt, that we shouldn't be messing with our institutions are failing us? Who's telling us this? Of course, it's the Russians, but it's also certain American politicians with backing from Silicon Valley. So why does Silicon Valley see Europe as a problem and something that needs to be shaken up, and something where dissident groups like AfD in Germany need to be encouraged and defended? And why is it a terrible thing that Britain is censoring hate speech? I think that if we actually look at our enemies, there's a kind of twisted compliment, that you only attack people you feel threatened by, or these people only attack people they feel threatened by. Of course, Europe is threatening to people like Putin, but it's also threatening to people like Peter Thiel, people who want to have the landscape completely free for unregulated artificial intelligence. So I think that there's a lesson in there in this kind of pincer movement, and maybe this is part of what's different between Trump 1 and Trump 2. That Trump 1 was a version of traditional Republican governance. Trump 2 is much more closely related to Silicon Valley, closing things down in the name of progress, eliminating parts of the government and talking about automating it. I think it's like a war to make the world safe for AI. And that is very troubling. As a European, I think that you need, nothing is so good that it doesn't need regulating, right? We need regulations, we need checks and balances, right? And to say, let's eliminate these trusted organizations and turn it all over to private businesses is, to me, disastrous. But maybe that's the game behind the policies that we're seeing now. Why do you need Voice of America when you have Twitter? Isn't that all the free speech the world can handle right there on X? Wait, who's telling us we don't need Voice of America? It wasn't Carrie Lake. It was the guy who controls X. America, who told you you were naked? Elon Musk. Vladimir Putin. Do we really want to be taking our information from those guys? Our self-understanding from those guys?
Well, if you go to the State Department website now and you see where the information sources, they have a page up where you can get direct information from the US State Department, and they highlight the platforms I highlight are Rumble, True Social, and some all tech platforms. There's actually a friend of mine texted me the webpage for it. To your point is that they're privileging certain free speech platforms as the official channels of US communication abroad. So that is an interesting dimension, but I would say that what you bring up, and I think a couple of questions bring up, there might be an ideological basis for this. I mean, part of what you're saying is that reputational security is somewhat based upon sort of a cosmopolitan view of the world, it seems, right? Like this idea of a liberal, cosmopolitan openness to cultural differences.
Yes, it's probably Mr. Cosmopolitan or Professor Cosmopolitan coming up with a political or interpretational theory that justifies its globalization.
Right, it's a globalist view, but that
also
seems
think
at
it's right.
odds.
But this is why, this came out of conversation with diplomats. So maybe I'm reflecting the vision of diplomats back on diplomats. But I also think that this, to me, this makes sense. And how else are we going to move? How else do we move forward in a world where we have to collaborate, where there is no unilateral solution, there is no single country option? You can't cut yourself loose. With the problems, we have to meet them together. We have to work together. We're going up unilateralism is necessarily a blind alley, but it's still a very attractive alley and a very entertaining alley, where you can think about it, be completely distracted by it. Hey, wouldn't it be great to reopen Alcatraz? Wouldn't it be great to do whatever crazy thing it is this week, accept an aircraft from Qatar? Yeah, you can think about it, but you can't fix the problems of the world that way.
On that note, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much. Thank you.